Welcome back to Module 2, Lecture 2 of the Senior Seminar. So at this point you should have just watched the cute little video about blob and semiotics. So just to recap, that video defined an icon versus an index versus a symbol, and I've abbreviated them here. And here, of course, we have an example of an icon of a drone, right? And we also probably have the symbol, right? We have the red circle with the line through it, right? Which, you know, only if you are connected to certain conventions would you know that means no or prohibited, right? As to whether there's an index in here, well, oh, and I forgot the little finger up there. Yeah, I'd say that little finger is probably there's probably a logical association with the object, right? So it's probably the finger that set it in motion, or something. I'm being silly. Okay. If it still doesn't quite make sense, I have liberated another explanation here that you can go through if you so desire. And our amis over in France give us a lovely example online. This is from the French government about what you should do in the event of a terrorist attack. And I think that they're particularly talking about a mass shooting attack, right? So I've come up with some examples here, and again with the help of my semiotics expert buddy, Mike Ledgerwood. So an icon might be an example of the human hiding behind a beam, right? So probably no matter which part of the world you're from, no matter what language you speak, you can probably figure that one out, right? It's a representation of a human hiding behind a beam, right? So an index might be an example of the arrows pointing to drop below the wall or to drop below the windows, right? A symbol would be an example of the red triangle. Look out! There's a red triangle coming, right? The red triangle warning sign. Again, if you weren't from, 21st century modern society, you would not know what that triangle meant, right? Okay, so one of the chapters that I assigned by Richard Jackson talks about scripts and cliches. Well, I don't think he uses the term cliches, but cliches, basically the same sort of thing as a script. Sometimes you might hear the word trope, right? And so basically he's saying that there are stereotypes or cliches in the discourse about terrorism. Right? So one such is that the September 11th attacks were an act of war and represent a clear turning point in history, right? So it's sort of like before Christ, after Christ, right? It's pre or post 9/11. The day that changed the world, right? And Jackson writes that non-state terrorism poses a significant... here he's going through the various stereotypes, right? Another one is that it's such a huge threat that without significant investment in counterterrorism, the world would end, basically, right? And so the point of these little graphics is to indicate that if you're in the United States, you are 775 times more likely to drown than you are to die from a terrorist attack. Diabetes, it's much worse, right? Only 12 times more likely to be struck by lightning than die in a terrorist attack. So another such stereotype or trope is the idea that contemporary terrorism is a new and more serious kind of threat, right? That we're living in this age of terror, right? And, again, that they're willing to use weapons of mass destruction, etc. And last week, of course, I noted that there was actually more terrorism in the late 20th century than there has been in this century. Another trope is that people become terrorists through a process of radicalization. Right, so if you can control this radicalization, then you can prevent terrorism, according to the stereotypes, right? And of course, there is the stereotype or the cliche that the fight against terrorism is struggle of good against evil, civilization against barbarism, liberty against totalitarianism, etc. Right? So it's very black or white. And don't forget that another part of this story is that the struggle against terrorism is a just cause which will result in eventual victory because, as we know, America will prevail, right? And because terrorism is so new and catastrophic, it justifies new and aggressive measures such as waterboarding, the atrocities at Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, restricting the rights of terrorist suspects such as the right to free speech, mass surveillance, blah, blah, blah. So if you wanted to, you could apply any of these scripts, or all of them, to the discourse about a particular topic you're thinking of for your paper, right? So if you wanted to look at something about, I don't know. Well, I guess you could talk about the alt-right, discussion of the alt-right as terrorists. You could go through and try to apply some of those cliches or stereotypes to it. Okay, at this point, you should pause this video and watch the Primetime War on Terror, a short video that I've put a link to below this lecture. So this, of course, was filmed in 2010, 2011, I think it was. So some of it does look a little bit dated, but the conclusions, I'm not really sure if the conclusions have changed a whole lot in the last decade. All right, so when you start to do your research, there's a wide variety of possible ways you could do a content or discourse analysis, right? One thing I'd suggested, and nobody took me up on it last year, but one thing I'd suggested was going through the online videos from other countries' equivalents to our TSA, right? Because most of the advanced industrialized countries anyway have tons of stuff online about how not to get pinched as a terrorist when you go through our airports. Then, of course, I should have put this disclaimer. This does not represent my views nor those of UAB. They're terrorist songs, right? You can do content analysis of songs old and new, and you don't really have to dig very hard to find these online, right? So sheet music was what they did before they had, YouTube, right? It was you bought the sheet music and then you sat around with your friends on the weekend and played it on the piano, right? So there's no shortage of KKK tunes, right? KKK great hits such as Mystic City, Klansman of the Ku Klux Klan, Protestant, Gentile, native-born man, hooded, knighted, robed, and true. Yeah, you get the idea here, right? So you might want to unpack some of the symbols in there. Right now, I'm sure that they're not referring to themselves as terrorists, right? But you could also look at communications from terrorists, and sometimes you do actually find the members of the KKK, for example, expressing themselves in letters to the editor, right? So here we have Anniston, Alabama, 1919. We shield, this is from the Exalted Cyclops of the KKK, we shield the sanctity of the home and the chastity of womanhood, right? We stand for the three highest ideals known, God, home, and country. Right? It goes on. So you might look, for example, how often does a particular group mention religion, right? So a lot of people who know that the KKK is about racism don't realize that they see themselves as having a divine Christian mission, right? Or you might look at how often does a particular terrorist group mention women, or in this case, women's chastity, right? So there are all kinds of ways you could spin that. One thing I find particularly interesting is the coverage of similar acts by people of different races, genders, religions, etc. And unfortunately, I couldn't get it all on one slide, but I was particularly interested in two stories that appeared next to each other in many newspapers in the United States. So one is two Marines held on multiple charges after a weekend of terror. Right, and the terror that they were inflicting was they were admittedly out to destroy the KKK. Right. So these papers at the very same time were showing us another story, Klansmen acquitted in Luiso slang. And you may know that Luiso was the white woman originally from somewhere in the north. I've forgotten exactly where. But she was the white woman who came down to help out in the civil rights struggle in the early 60s. And, you know, what she did was she drove people to and fro. She drove the African-American protesters around and died in a car bomb from the Klan, right? So the jury, the Alabama jury acquitted them, right? But if you notice here in the article, and you could, you know, this ran in a variety of papers, they don't call it terror, right? So the KKK is not perpetrating terror at the very same time that the two Negro Marines who are out to destroy the KKK are depicted as terrorists, right? Similarly, you could look at the Zoot Suit terror of 1943. It actually took place in a number of cities, but I think LA was the major one. Zoot Suit is a particular style of dress that was popular among Latinos at that time. And it had, the Zoot Suit wars had to do with rivalries between young Latinos and U.S. Troops, primarily white U.S. troops who were, you know, stationed here often just briefly before they were being sent out to fight in World War II. Right. So you can see here, servicemen strip and beat 5 youths treated at the hospital. Right. So they comb the streets looking on the lookout for Zoot Suiters. Right. So simply on the basis of wearing, you know, basically an identifiably Latino costume, you were going to be roughed up, right? But it's kind of interesting how it's not depicted as terrorism or racism, right? The cholitas as a derogatory reference to their girlfriends or wives, right? So one thing that's important to remember is, and we'll talk about this more, is that in your research you're going to be trying to explain a puzzle. Right, so this paper is not simply a rehashing of facts, but you're going to look at a puzzle and you're going to try to figure out something that does not make sense. Right, so I copied this from the Jackson reading, right, and he's going through some of the puzzles or mysteries about terrorism. And one of them I've actually already talked about, right? So how could individuals such as Nelson Mandela, remember we talked about him last week, transmute or change from being widely condemned terrorists to Nobel Peace Prize winners, right? And I'll let you read through this again yourself, but he also talks about the changing meanings of the word terrorism during the French Revolution, and then also how the word terrorism's meaning changed from the French Revolution to today. So just to emphasize, what you are doing for this class should be answering a puzzle, or trying to, right? It's not a report. And here I've gone through some puzzles that I have tried to address in research over the last I guess these are basically the last 15 years, right? And again, I'll let you hash through that yourself, right? So your answer should be an argument. It shouldn't be simply a statement of fact, right? You don't want to say women play an important role in the army in North Korea, right? That's that would be, basically a statement. What you might want to say is women play an important role in the army because da da da. So these were some of the arguments. One of the pieces, I really have not finished the research yet, so I didn't have any argument quite yet. And another thing I want to stress about your papers is that you are creating new knowledge. This is a senior seminar. This is a 400 level class. You're not writing a report on terrorism by North Korea, right? You're going to come up with some new knowledge about it, and this is going to involve library research. And that is because you have to make sure that what you're doing isn't something that's already been done, right? So it probably involves going to the library, or at least using their online databases, JSTOR. A lot of students don't realize that Google Scholar is really useful. Just type in Google Scholar, and it's best if you're on campus, or I guess you can VPN into campus if you're off, because when you search for something, if our library has access to it, if you're online and on campus, it will show right here. Wow, here it is. All you got to do is click on this, and then this particular article will show up. So, for example, last time I taught this class, I don't think they actually went down this path, but one of the groups was interested in the mental health impact on LGBTQ people of the Pulse Club shooting, right? So I used that as an example here. And also, if our library does not have it, you can get it through interlibrary loan. Right? Another approach, or another topic that you might want to look at, has to do with recent and current events. And here I've given you a couple. What was the effect on mental health for University of Alabama students of having one of their classmates plead guilty to funneling money to Al-Qaeda, right, et cetera, et cetera. That might be one approach you could take. If you wanted to, you could study the monuments of a discourse, right? You could take some particularly important works and do a content analysis or discourse analysis on them, right? Looking at, the sacred texts of a particular discipline, subject area, etc. In terms of contested representations, right, or ways of depicting terrorism that people don't agree on, what challenges to the discourse are permitted or prescribed? Prescribed means banned, right? What representations are permitted to change quickly? And here I chose Banksy's mural in Palestine, or it might be Israel, I'm not sure. But in any case, the little girl's searching the soldier, right? So graffiti would be an example of a challenge to the discourse that's not necessarily permitted, right? Especially if, we know it gets covered up the next day, etc. So who is it that gets to actually debate, right? And one example you may remember from last year, federal money and the Duke University of North Carolina Consortium for Middle Eastern Studies. I'll let you read this for yourself. But basically, the Trump administration and the U.S. Department of Education did not think that Duke and UNC should be the gatekeepers for the discourse on terrorism in the Middle East. Right. And so here's the continuation of that article, and then I went through and clipped, the various little things from Facebook or Twitter that the center put out so that you could get a sense of what it is that they actually do, right? So what challenges to the discourse are being prescribed here, right? What is the objection from the administration to this particular academic research center? Okay, chapter 7. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to stop it here just in the interest of uploading it quickly. I'll stop it here, and so this will be conclusion of part 2, and there will be one more part. Stay tuned.